The day had started like any other late summer afternoon at Silverpine Lake, nestled deep within the sprawling wilderness of northern Minnesota. The lake, a vast, shimmering expanse surrounded by dense pine forests and rugged granite cliffs, had long been a secret refuge for locals seeking solitude amid nature's indifferent beauty. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, mingling with the faint musk of freshwater lilies blooming near the shore. The wind whispered softly through the towering evergreens, a faint rustling sound that carried both comfort and unease. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where the chatter of civilization gave way to the quiet pulse of the wild. For 12-year-old Lucas Harper, Silverpine was more than just a lake, it was a sanctuary. A place where he could escape the troubles of school, the endless hum of small-town gossip, and the brittle tension that had recently settled between his parents. Lucas was a boy of curiosity and cautious bravery, with a lean frame hardened by years of running through woods, climbing trees, and skimming stones across water. His dark hair was always tangled, and his bright green eyes held a flicker of determination that suggested he understood the wilderness better than most adults around him. His mother, Sarah, had instilled in him a respect for nature, teaching him to identify the calls of loons and the tracks of deer, while his father, a local mechanic, had reluctantly indulged his son's adventurous spirit, warning him to be careful but never grounding his freedom. That Saturday afternoon, Lucas had slipped away from the crowded family picnic by the lakeside, a noisy gathering of relatives and old neighbors, whose laughter and voices seemed to jar against the stillness he craved. He carried with him a small backpack packed with essentials, a water bottle, a pocketknife, a map of the lake's lesser-known trails, and a well-worn field journal where he sketched plants and animals he observed. He had plans to explore a small inlet on the lake's far eastern shore, a hidden cove he'd discovered weeks earlier with his father's help. As Lucas made his way along the rocky shoreline, the sun hung low, casting long amber shadows across the water's glassy surface. The occasional splash of a fish jumping broke the silence, accompanied by the distant call of an osprey. His bare feet left faint impressions in the cool sand as he approached the cove, heart quickening with the thrill of solitude. The cove was a perfect crescent, sheltered by thick stands of cedar and birch, with a small pebble beach that beckoned like a secret kept safe by the forest. Lucas shed his shirt and jeans, leaving them folded neatly on a smooth boulder, then slipped into the lake. The water was icy but refreshing, a sharp contrast to the humid air. As he swam further from shore, the lake's depth deepened suddenly, the sunlight filtering through the clear water in dancing patterns on the submerged rocks below. Lucas paused to float on his back, eyes closed, breathing the pine-scented air, feeling utterly alone but not lonely. Time seemed to stretch, a blissful moment carved out from the noisy world he left behind. Meanwhile, back at the picnic area, Sarah glanced at her watch and called for Lucas to return. She had grown uneasy after 15 minutes with no sign of her son. His older sister, Emily, a sharp-minded 16-year-old with an intuitive grasp of people's moods, joined her mother in scanning the shoreline, worry threading their faces. The hours ticked by with no word, no sign of Lucas's return. Panic began to seep into the crowd, a quiet, mounting dread that settled like a cold weight on everyone's shoulders. By early evening, local search and rescue volunteers were called in. Teams combed the dense forest, the rocky beaches, and the winding trails. Boats scoured the lake's surface under fading light, their spotlights flickering against the dark water. The smell of wet pine needles and earth was now mingled with the sharp tang of smoke from a nearby campfire, where worried relatives gathered, huddled in small groups, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. Despite hours of searching, no trace of Lucas was found, no footprints beyond the cove, no belongings left behind, no sign of struggle. The only clue was a small, damp notebook that Lucas's father found tucked beneath a mossy rock near the inlet, its pages smeared but still legible, filled with hastily scrawled sketches of the lake's flora and a single note that read, "Safe here. Will return soon." The mystery deepened when, 2 hours after Lucas's disappearance, a separate group of campers reported finding a backpack on the opposite side of Silverpine Lake, abandoned on a rocky beach nearly 3 miles from where Lucas was last seen. The backpack contained his hiking boots, a half-empty water bottle, and a strange, hand-carved wooden token, a small, intricately detailed figure resembling a loon, unlike anything Lucas owned or had ever shown interest in. No sign of Lucas himself. The token, weathered and worn, was puzzling. It bore no markings, no initials, and seemed almost out of place in the familiar wilderness. Authorities collected the items but were baffled. How had the backpack traveled so far across the lake's vast expanse? Was it a clue, or a cruel red herring? The local police chief, James Everett, a pragmatic man with decades of experience in rural investigations, oversaw the initial response. Despite mounting efforts and community support, the search was eventually scaled back after 2 grueling weeks yielded no leads. The lake, indifferent as ever, returned to its tranquil state, the pine trees whispering secrets the world could not yet hear. Years passed. The disappearance of Lucas Harper became a lingering ache in the heart of the community, a cold case whispered about in local diners and around campfires, accompanied by countless theories and rumors. Sarah Harper refused to give up. She spent countless hours poring over maps, interviewing campers and fishermen, piecing together any small hint that might unlock the truth. Her grief was raw and unrelenting, but it forged her into a relentless seeker of answers, a mother who refused to let silence be the final word. Then, nearly 10 years later, an unexpected discovery shook the stillness. A team of environmental scientists conducting a long-term study on Silverpine's shifting shoreline stumbled upon a shallow, partially buried campsite deep within a narrow, seldom visited bay on the lake's western shore. Among the remnants, charred wood, rusted cans, and weathered fabric, they found a tattered jacket embroidered with Lucas's name and a fragment of a broken compass matching the model Lucas had carried. The campsite was shielded by steep cliffs and thick underbrush, nearly invisible except to those who knew where to look. What was most baffling was the discovery of another carved wooden token, identical to the one found years before, but this one displayed a fresh, deliberate scratch across its surface, as if someone had tried to erase a symbol or message. The scientists alerted the authorities, reigniting the investigation and bringing new eyes to the mystery. Detective Elise Grant, a specialist in cold cases with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and empathy, was assigned to lead the reinvestigation. With her background in forensic anthropology and a deep respect for wilderness survival techniques, Detective Elise Grant arrived at Silverpine Lake in the early morning hours, her boots crunching over frost-stiffened pine needles as fog clung low to the ground like something half alive. She had spent the previous week reviewing every detail of the original case file, witness statements, terrain maps, weather records, and forensic reports from the time of Lucas Harper's disappearance, but now she needed to feel the place itself, to breathe its air, to walk the same trails that had once carried the small, eager feet of a boy who had vanished without a trace. The campsite discovered by the environmental research team was cordoned off but preserved carefully, thanks to the foresight of the scientists who had understood the gravity of what they'd found. It was not a place easily reached. Elise had to hike through 2 miles of dense brush, traversing uneven granite outcroppings and ducking beneath low-hanging branches that scratched at her coat like grasping fingers. When she finally emerged into the narrow bay, she stood still for a long moment, absorbing the tableau before her. The remnants of the fire pit were blackened and cold, its stones charred but still perfectly arranged. The nearby rocks bore traces of soot, suggesting that the fire had burned long enough to stain the granite. Beside it, the collapsed remains of a canvas tarp fluttered slightly in the breeze, mottled with mildew and softened by years of exposure. The piece of jacket with Lucas's name, stitched in the looping cursive of a worried mother's hand, was tucked beneath a fallen log, half buried in moss. But the most disturbing find was the second wooden token, almost identical to the first, another loon, carved with care, but this one featured a deep slash across its side, as though someone had intentionally defaced it. Elise took photos from multiple angles, bagged the token, and then knelt beside the fire pit to examine the soil. The earth was packed with layers of ash, pine needles, and bits of fragmented bone, not human, she confirmed later, but likely rabbit or squirrel, scavenged and cooked. Someone had survived here for a time. But who? And when? A wildlife camera placed by the researchers just 2 weeks before had captured nothing but a family of foxes and the occasional deer. No signs of recent human activity. Back at the sheriff's office, Elise convened with Chief Everett, who had overseen the original case. He was older now, heavier, his once dark hair gone to steel, but his mind remained sharp and his guilt sharper. "I always felt we missed something," he confessed quietly as he poured black coffee into a chipped mug. "That kid didn't just disappear into thin air. But we combed every inch of that forest. Boats. Dogs. Helicopters. It made no damn sense then, and it still doesn't." Elise nodded. The original search grid never included the western inlet. Why? Everett hesitated. Terrain's brutal. Steep cliffs, no marked trails. We figured if Lucas had made it that far, we'd find some sign, blood, clothes, anything. But there was nothing. "Now we have something," she replied, tapping a finger on the bag token. "Two, actually. The first was found with his backpack across the lake. The second here. Both loons, both hand-carved. But no one in the family recognizes them. And Lucas didn't carve." That afternoon, Elise met with Sarah Harper for the first time. The woman had aged more than 10 years should have demanded. Her face was taut with grief, her eyes the deep, dull blue of a person whose every waking moment was tethered to loss. Her living room was a shrine to Lucas, photos, his sketches framed on the walls, a row of his books still neatly stacked on a low shelf. She welcomed Elise with a cautious nod. "You think he was there," Sarah said without waiting for preamble, gesturing to the printed photos Elise laid on the table. "His jacket, yes," Elise replied. "And I believe the camp was built with care. Someone stayed there. For how long, I don't know." Sarah leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you think he was alive, after the search ended?" "It's possible," Elise said carefully. "But there's something else. This carving." She placed the 2 loon tokens side by side. Sarah examined them without recognition. "He didn't make these. Lucas drew birds, but he didn't carve. And he wouldn't have just left his things." Elise nodded. "That's what puzzles me. Whoever made these wanted them to be seen. The second one, it's been marked, like it was defaced. Could be a warning. Or a message." A day later, Elise tracked down the man who had reported the first backpack nearly 10 years earlier, Gary Morton, a retired park ranger now living in Duluth. He remembered the incident vividly. "I thought it had drifted ashore. Storms do weird things out here. But the thing is, it was dry. That pack hadn't been floating. It was placed. That's what bothered me." He'd told the sheriff that at the time, but with no other evidence and no witnesses, it was dismissed. Elise asked whether he'd noticed anything strange nearby. "Just the token," he said. "I remember thinking it looked old. Like something carved by hand decades ago." Elise sent both tokens to the state lab for material analysis and contacted a forensic wood specialist, an unusual request, but she needed to know if the carvings were contemporary or older, and if the scratch across the second was recent. The answer came back 2 days later. Both were made from birchwood common to the region. The carving style was primitive but practiced, likely by the same hand. But the slash on the second had been made with a metal blade, possibly a knife, within the last 5 years. That placed it well after Lucas's disappearance. Someone had returned to that site, someone who knew what had happened. Meanwhile, word of the reopened case spread quickly. The local paper ran a feature titled "Silverpine Secrets," prompting dozens of calls and emails to the sheriff's office. Most were vague or speculative, but one stood out, a woman named Carol Dawson, who had been camping at Silverpine a week before Lucas vanished. Her teenage son, Eli, had wandered off one evening and returned shaken, claiming he saw a man watching him from the tree-line near the inlet. At the time, Carol had dismissed it as imagination. But now, years later, she recalled the detail that chilled her. Her son had said the man held something small and wooden in his hand. "Like a bird, Mom," he'd said. He was holding a bird. Elise drove to the Dawsons' current home in St. Cloud. Eli, now in his 20s, was hesitant but confirmed the memory. He was tall. Wearing old clothes, not like rags, but faded. I didn't see his face. Just his eyes, kind of sunk in. And yeah, he had something wooden. I remember it. Looked like it was carved. Elise pressed for details. Did he say anything? No. Just stared. I ran. A new thread was forming, unconfirmed but impossible to ignore. She compiled a list of locals who had lived near Silverpine at the time, especially reclusive individuals, woodworkers, or survivalists. One name emerged repeatedly in old park records and interviews: Arthur Bellamy. A Vietnam veteran who had once worked as a seasonal trail maintenance worker for the state park, Bellamy had a reputation for being eccentric. He lived off-grid, in a self-built cabin 2 miles from the lake's northern border. He hadn't been seen in years. Elise hiked to the site, accompanied by 2 deputies. The cabin was long abandoned, its roof partially caved in, vines snaking through broken windows. Inside. The morning after she spotted the third token in the photograph, Elise Grant returned to the isolated western campsite with a forensic recovery team and a botanist from the Department of Natural Resources. The token in the photo, carved into the shape of a fox with a cryptic symbol beneath its feet, had not been logged, tagged, or touched by the scientists who had made the original discovery, likely overlooked due to its partial burial behind a moss-covered log. But it was there. Still intact. The birchwood had darkened slightly from exposure, but the edges were sharp, the etching precise. Elise carefully retrieved the token with nitrile gloves, placed it in a sterile bag, and held it up against the others. A pattern was beginning to form. A loon, twice. A fox, once. All with similar craftsmanship, all left intentionally. But this new symbol was something else. Unlike the defaced loon carving or the pristine bird found near the backpack, the fox token bore an abstract mark that defied interpretation, a perfect circle intersected by 3 deliberate diagonal slashes, each drawn with symmetry too exact to be casual. Elise had it photographed, catalogued, and sent immediately to 2 experts, a semiotics professor at the University of Minnesota and a retired DNR cryptography consultant who had once analyzed symbols used in remote trail markers by off-grid survivalists. While awaiting their analyses, Elise turned her focus back to Arthur Bellamy's journal. She read it again, line by line, her mind circling the scrawled repetition of Lucas's name. On the page with the name were strange, fragmented notes: boy by lake, safe with me, not long, hunger wins. The surrounding pages offered little context, descending into paranoid gibberish about shadows in the water and forest watchers. Bellamy's mental health had clearly deteriorated, perhaps worsened by years of isolation. Yet beneath the confusion, Elise sensed a fractured conscience, a possible attempt at documenting something he had done, or regretted. She took the journal to Sarah Harper that afternoon. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages, lips parted, but her voice remained steady. That name, that handwriting. It's not Lucas's. He was neat, careful. This is rushed. Erratic. Elise nodded. It belonged to a man named Arthur Bellamy. Lived in a cabin not far from the lake. Passed away 6 years ago. We didn't find any official connection to Lucas, but he clearly knew his name. So he took him? Sarah asked, eyes wide with a flicker of desperate hope. Or helped him? We're not sure, Elise answered. But he may not have acted alone. Elise had begun assembling a new timeline, one that included possible sightings of a boy matching Lucas's description in the months following his disappearance, brief, often dismissed at the time. A child glimpsed near the logging roads. Footprints too small to be a man's. One report from 2016 mentioned a teenager in ragged clothes who ran from a seasonal ranger vehicle near the lake's northern edge. The ranger had assumed it was a runaway. No follow-up had ever occurred. Elise traced that ranger, Ben Kirtley, now retired in Ely. When interviewed, Ben confirmed the encounter. He was fast, he recalled. Wiry. Didn't look right, dirty clothes, hair like he hadn't seen a mirror in weeks. Thought about calling it in, but I figured he was just a kid sneaking off for some solitude. Regret that now. Elise showed him a photo of Lucas at age 12. Could have been, he said, brows furrowed. I can't swear it, but, yeah. Same build. Same kind of haunted eyes. That word stuck with Elise, haunted. If Lucas had survived, for days or even months after his disappearance, then something or someone had kept him from returning. Elisa's next step took her deep into the history of Silverpine itself. She combed through ranger reports, local oral histories, even archived folk legends. One tale recurred, a story passed down by Ojibwe elders and later twisted by European settlers. It told of a secluded area on the lake, a natural rock basin known by the old name Niweshanong, the place that forgets. Hunters who camped there claimed to lose time. Some returned with no memory of how they got back. Others vanished entirely. While Elise didn't believe in curses or magic, she knew legends often cloaked truths. Places with terrain irregularities, magnetic fields, or environmental factors could create confusion or disorientation. She marked Niweshanong's location on her map, directly adjacent to the area where the third token had been found. Coincidence? Maybe. But she doubted it. Days later, the semiotics professor responded with preliminary findings. The symbol on the fox token, he wrote, was not common to any known language or code but bore resemblance to threshold marks, symbolic representations used in indigenous and European occult traditions to denote passage between states, known and unknown, safety and danger, life and death. It may be a personal or idiosyncratic creation, he concluded, but its intent appears ritualistic. The cryptography consultant was more direct. You're looking at a signature, he wrote. Whoever made these was marking territory or steps in a process. It's not just a message, it's a trail. A trail. That thought kept Elise awake that night. If the tokens were waypoints, or milestones, then perhaps there were more. She returned to the lake's western edge with a canine search unit, combing a half-mile radius around the fire pit. After hours of fruitless searching, one of the dogs barked near a twisted stand of birch. Beneath the roots, partially concealed by leaves and thyme, was a fourth token. This one depicted a bear, crudely carved but unmistakable. Unlike the others, it bore no symbol. Instead, its underside was scorched, blackened as if pressed against flame. Elise turned it over in her hands and felt an overwhelming chill. It was heavy. Heavier than the others. It had weight, literal and symbolic. That evening, she laid out all four tokens in sequence. The loon, the fox with the symbol, the scorched bear, and the second damaged loon. The order was uncertain, but they told a story. One of movement. Of transformation. Of threat. She now believed that Lucas had encountered Bellamy, either by accident or design. That Bellamy, unstable but perhaps well-intentioned, had sheltered him. That something happened to change that dynamic. Hunger. Isolation. Or someone else. Because there was one more detail Elise hadn't shared widely yet. In the new forensic report from the fire pit, a fifth DNA profile had been recovered. Trace skin cells from beneath a rock used to hold the tarp in place. It wasn't Lucas's. And it wasn't Bellamy's. It was an unknown male, profile partially degraded but viable. A new player in the mystery. Elise ran the sample through Cody's. No matches. She contacted a genealogical analysis firm specializing in familial DNA mapping. The results would take weeks. In the meantime, Elise requested files on all seasonal workers, drifters, and long-term campers registered in the Silverpine region between 2010 and 2016. Among the names was one that hadn't surfaced before: Daniel Rusk, a former outdoor survival instructor with a dishonorable discharge from the Army. Rusk had been arrested in 2013 for trespassing on DNR land but was never prosecuted. He'd lived out of his truck for years, then vanished from record in 2015. No known residents. No family. Just a trail of minor offenses and untraceable wilderness movements. She dug deeper. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting a deep amber hue across the savanna, where the land still bore the scars of the brutal battle that had changed everything, where the grass was trampled and darkened with dried blood, and where silence had now returned like a cautious visitor, hesitant to disturb the ghost still lingering in the air. The buffalo, battered and limping, stood tall amid the golden waves of the field, his sides still torn, the deep gashes scabbing over in jagged lines. And though his breath came ragged and his legs shook beneath his massive frame, he refused to rest, not yet, for his herd had moved, and he could not afford to be left behind, not now, not after so much had been lost. His mind wandered constantly to the younger male who had died protecting him, a sacrifice that carved a hollow in his chest far deeper than any lion's claw, and he carried that weight like a sacred stone, each step forward a vow to honor it, to live not just for himself but for the memory of the one who had fallen. But survival was a cruel taskmaster, and though the lions had retreated, the scent of blood on the wind still tempted scavengers, and the buffalo's ears flicked toward every rustle in the grass, every distant screech, for he knew the savanna was never still for long, and something was always watching. Miles away, the herd moved cautiously through a dry riverbed, their hooves kicking up dust, the matriarch at the front pausing often to listen, her eyes searching the distance for signs of their missing comrade, the one whose absence pressed like a bruise on their collective instinct, and the calf who had watched the entire attack, its wide eyes having seen far too much for something so young, lingered at the rear, turning often to look behind, his heart tethered to the injured giant who had once stood between him and death. The old buffalo's journey was slow, his body failing him in new ways each hour, his head lowered as he pushed forward. Through thorny scrub, his coat matted with dirt and dried blood, the sun scorching his back and the flies relentless in their pursuit, and yet there was a strange clarity in his suffering, a rhythm to the pain that made each step sacred, a march not just toward survival but toward something deeper, something ancestral and eternal. One night, he collapsed beneath the skeleton of a fallen tree, the branches bare like bones clawing at the sky, and he lay there under the stars, his breath shallow, the pain spreading into his ribs and spine, and for a moment, he let go, closing his eyes as the world faded. But then something shifted, the sound of cautious hooves on soft dirt, a low murmur carried by the wind, and he opened his eyes to see the calf standing there, trembling, its ears perked, its eyes wet with recognition and fear, and behind it, the matriarch and a few others, their presence like a balm, like water after fire. They had come back, not all of them, but enough to make his heart beat harder in his chest, and the matriarch stepped forward, her snout brushing gently against his, a gesture that transcended language and time, a whisper of unity, of forgiveness, of family. The calf pressed itself against the old bull's side, and he felt something unlock inside him, a strength not born of muscle or defiance but of purpose, and with a grunt, he pushed himself back to his feet, every joint screaming, every nerve alight with fire, and yet he stood, taller now than before, not because his wounds had healed but because he had found meaning through them. They moved together under the cover of night, slow and quiet, navigating the terrain with cautious grace, the matriarch leading but often glancing back to ensure he was still with them, and the calf never straying far from his flank, their connection forged not just by blood or instinct but by shared survival, a bond unbreakable even by death. Days passed, and the lions remained absent, as if some unspoken boundary had been drawn, as if even predators understood that there were moments too sacred to trespass upon, and the buffalo found shade in a grove of acacias where the wounds on his side finally began to close, the flies thinning, the fever breaking, and the herd growing stronger around him. But peace on the savanna was always fleeting, and one afternoon, while clouds rolled in from the east and thunder groaned across the plains, a new threat emerged. Not of claw or fang but of man, a hunting truck. Rumbling across the distant ridge, carrying rifles and steel, its silhouette unfamiliar but unmistakable, the matriarch froze, her ears alert, and the old buffalo stepped forward, something primal surging through him, a fierce protectiveness that transcended his pain, and in that moment, he realized the battle was not over, it had only changed shape, its enemy no longer roaring beasts but the quiet thunder of engines and the gleam of metal. As the truck grew closer, the herd retreated deeper into the acacia thickets, their movements quick and silent, but the old buffalo turned back, his body a wall between the humans and his family, his breath steady despite the tremble in his knees, his eyes locked on the oncoming threat. He stood motionless, not with the recklessness of youth but with the quiet courage of something ancient and knowing, and the men in the truck slowed, confused perhaps by the defiance in the eyes of a beast that should have fled, one marked by scars and time, and for a long moment, they simply watched, unsure whether to shoot or to move on. Then, the sky cracked open with lightning, and rain began to fall in great sheets, muddying the path, blurring the vision, and the truck slowly turned, its tires spinning as it retreated down the ridge, leaving only the rumble of thunder and the scent of wet earth behind. When the buffalo finally turned and rejoined the herd, his steps were heavier, but his heart was lightened, for he had defended them again, not with violence but with presence, with the sheer force of will, and the calf nuzzled him as if to say he understood. That night, they lay together beneath the dripping canopy, the storm now a memory, and for the first time in many moons, the old bull slept without fear, his dreams not filled with blood or roaring but with grasslands bathed in golden light, and the soft warmth of those he had saved. He crouched behind the last rusted metal crate just inside the interior hangar wall, breath shallow, sweat trailing down the back of his neck, the stench of oil, dust, and metal heavy in the air as the footsteps of enemy soldiers echoed through the corridor ahead. The weight of the stolen field radio clutched in his hands was nothing compared to the pressure inside his chest, a rhythmic pounding that threatened to betray him if he let it get out of control. Night had fallen hard outside the base, and inside, it was worse. Dim red lights cast twisted shadows that danced across peeling walls, and the occasional clatter of boots or a barked command kept his nerves on edge. Every second he lingered, the odds worsened, but he wasn't ready to call it in just yet, not without finding the central communications room. That was the key. The moment he made the transmission, the enemy would scramble, the alarm would shriek, and every hallway would turn into a gauntlet. So he moved carefully, every step calculated, pressing his body into the wall whenever he heard motion, his mind mapping the layout with each turn and junction. He passed a dormitory, silent and dark save for the muffled snores of sleeping soldiers. Beyond that, a mess hall filled with overturned chairs and trays left in haste, an eerie stillness clinging to the empty space. It was a ghost base in some ways, operational but tense, like they were waiting for something. As he reached a stairwell, a voice crackled over the base's PA system, garbled, short, but tense, and he froze, understanding only the tone. They knew someone had breached the perimeter. His heartbeat surged. He ducked into a storage closet, waited, counted 20 seconds, 30, then pressed on. The corridors narrowed near the command wing, and he finally spotted what he needed, a glass window revealing a room with banks of equipment, glowing screens, and a large table where 3 officers stood studying a map. There was a guard outside, one man, half asleep and fiddling with his belt. Too dangerous to engage, but he couldn't afford delay. He scanned the ceiling, ventilation grates above, reachable if he climbed the exposed pipes. It was a desperate idea, but it was what he had. Quietly, he scaled the side, lifting himself inch by inch, until his boots were level with the guard's head. A soft clank made the guard look up just as the soldier froze, body pressed into the metal like a spider. After a tense moment, the guard yawned, muttered something in frustration, and stepped away, disappearing around the corner. The soldier didn't hesitate. He dropped, rolled, and slipped into the communications room, locking the door behind him before the officers had time to register his presence. They turned, surprised, and instinctively reached for sidearms, but he raised his weapon first, not to shoot, but to command silence. "Stay quiet," he hissed, then pointed to the radio panel. "Which one transmits to your outposts?" One of the officers hesitated, then slowly nodded toward the center console. "You won't make it out," another growled. "Maybe not," the soldier said, pulling the field radio from his pack and connecting it with trembling fingers to the terminal. He flipped through frequencies, heart pounding, eyes scanning the controls. A siren began to wail from outside. His presence was now fully known. "Command, this is Shadow, repeat, Shadow," he whispered into the mic. "Enemy base infiltrated. Coordinates 217 by 340. Strike window is small. I say again, strike now." Static. Then a reply, garbled but clear enough. "Copy, Shadow. Reinforcements inbound. Hold position." He exhaled. Then turned to face the officers again. "I'm not here to kill you," he said. "I just want this over." They stared at him with a mix of fear and hatred. The door behind him rattled. Fists pounded. Voices shouted. He stepped back into the corner of the room, taking cover behind the console. The first shots shattered the glass window as soldiers opened fire from the corridor. Sparks flew, screens cracked, and the air filled with the acrid scent of burning circuits. He returned fire sparingly, not to kill but to suppress, and then, using the room's rear maintenance door, he slipped into another narrow hallway. Alarms blared in full now, red lights spinning, soldiers rushing in every direction. The base had become chaos. He moved swiftly, instinct taking over, navigating by sound and memory as he raced toward the loading bay. His only chance was the supply trucks parked near the southern fence. If one was unlocked, he could escape before the strike team arrived. A sharp pain tore through his left arm. He'd been grazed, maybe more, but adrenaline masked it. He pushed on. Smoke began to fill the corridors from somewhere, maybe sabotage, maybe just a result of panic. He heard shouting in another language, commands being shouted over radios, doors slamming. Then, miraculously, he reached the exit tunnel leading to the vehicle depot. A single guard stood there, gun raised. "Stop," he yelled. But the soldier didn't. He tossed a flash grenade, turned his head, and rushed forward as the white light burst. The guard screamed, fell, and the soldier vaulted over him. Outside, the night was pitch black but alive with motion, soldiers pouring into defensive positions, scanning the skies, confused. He ducked low, running between parked trucks, finally finding one with the keys still dangling from the ignition. He climbed in, slammed the door shut, started the engine. Diesel roared to life, and tires squealed as he drove straight through a stack of crates, crashing into open space. Gunfire rattled behind him, but he didn't slow. Ahead, the gate was down, but a fuel truck had stopped beside it, and he aimed straight for it, weaving around and using it as partial cover as he crashed through the fence. Metal screamed. Something exploded behind him. Then he was on the outer road, the base shrinking behind him, fires flickering in the distance, the sound of helicopters drawing closer from the far horizon. He didn't stop until the forest swallowed him. There, under cover of trees, he finally abandoned the truck, dragging himself into the underbrush just as the roar of jet engines filled the night sky. Moments later, the first strike hit, flames erupted far behind him, and the entire forest lit up briefly with the light of controlled devastation. He smiled through the pain, his heart slowing, breath ragged. The transmission had worked. The enemy base was falling. But he wasn't done yet. He still had to make it back, still had to cross 30 kilometers of hostile terrain to reach his people, to tell them what he had seen and heard inside, the plans, the maps, the truths no one yet knew. The war wasn't over. But tonight, one man lying on a dusty road had turned the tide, and he would keep going, crawling through mud and shadow, until the mission was complete. The cabin had grown quieter since the last storm rolled over the distant treetops, but inside, the silence felt sharpened, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and eyes that no longer dared meet each other directly, not after what they had begun to uncover in the rusted basement trapdoor beneath the floorboards. Nora was the first to return from the woods after the morning fog lifted, cradling a cracked compass she'd found buried under wet leaves, its needle spinning in slow, confused circles as though disoriented by something deeper than magnetism. Thomas, sitting on the stairs with his back to the wall and rifle resting across his knees, barely reacted, his face sunken in a hard, unfamiliar stillness. Julian was upstairs, rifling through a chest of strange clothing wrapped in plastic, not just jackets or flannel shirts, but uniforms, some in languages none of them could identify, others scorched at the sleeves, and beneath them, a ledger written in cramped handwriting, each page marked with dates, initials, and cold, clinical phrases like, intake confirmed, exposure complete, and transport success. Whatever this place had once been, hunting lodge, shelter, or secret, it was something far more elaborate than they had imagined, and now, after 2 months missing, after the forest had swallowed them whole and then delivered them inexplicably here, the question none of them voiced but all felt was whether they had ever truly left that mountain ridge or if they were still somehow inside its grasp, trapped in a radius not defined by miles but by memory and intent. On the second night after the cellar had been opened, Thomas woke with blood dripping from his nose, convinced he'd heard a voice calling his name through the walls, low and drawn out, not in English or any language he knew, but one that felt carved into the bones behind his ears, like the murmur of something ancient that had been waiting far too long. Nora began pacing, wearing Julian's coat though it didn't fit, muttering about patterns in the tree rings, and names carved under bark, and when Julian returned from a walk near the riverbank with a pale, silent look, they all knew he had seen something too, though he refused to say what. The days stretched long and hollow, each one marked by small discoveries, a locked room behind the pantry filled with broken surveillance equipment, a journal half-burnt that referenced site relocation and failure of concealment protocols, a blood-stained boot that none of them recognized. They stopped trying to contact the outside world. The shortwave radio in the main room spat static no matter how they tuned it, and the emergency phones, once neatly lined on the wall, gave only dead clicks, as if disconnected not from the grid but from time itself. Then came the smell. It arrived subtly at first, a faint metallic tang in the air, like rain on copper, but within days it became overpowering, saturating the cabin until it clung to their clothes and skin. Julian took to sleeping outside on the porch wrapped in blankets, claiming he couldn't breathe indoors, while Nora ripped up every floorboard she could find, searching for a leak or a body or something deeper that might explain the rot. But there was nothing, only cold earth beneath the house, marked by strange holes dug long ago, some filled back in, others still open, as though waiting. When Thomas finally spoke again, his voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in weeks, and he said only one thing: "We were brought here." He didn't elaborate, didn't respond to questions. He just sat, eyes glazed, rocking slightly on the bottom step until Julian, desperate and angry, screamed that they needed to leave, now, and stormed outside. He didn't come back that night. The next morning, they found his boots on the edge of the river, neatly placed side by side, and the shape of a person lying in the wet grass, pressed into the earth like a shadow that had sunk instead of faded. Nora refused to look at it. She shut herself in the upstairs room and began drawing circles on the walls with charcoal from the fireplace, muttering the same 4 words again and again: "It doesn't let go." With Julian gone, the balance shifted. Thomas grew increasingly paranoid, accusing Nora of calling it closer with her drawings, while Nora said Thomas was already part of it, and that he had been ever since the cellar opened. Neither was eating much. The food they had found in the hidden pantry, vacuum-sealed packets labeled in military font, began to taste foul, metallic, like old coins. Water from the tap, which had once run cold and clear from a nearby well system, turned brackish and greenish, and Nora swore she saw something moving inside the jug when she poured it. They started boiling everything, then stopped drinking entirely, relying instead on rainwater collected in buckets outside. On the 12th night, Nora vanished. No note, no sound, no screams. Her drawings on the walls had grown erratic, shifting from circles to spirals to something resembling a map of the forest, or perhaps the cabin itself, seen from angles that didn't quite make sense, with rooms where no doors existed and tunnels that twisted underground in impossible loops. Thomas searched the woods for 3 days before he found the jacket she had worn draped on a tree branch, 50 feet above the ground, with a fresh, clean cut straight down the center of the back. There were no footprints, no drag marks. Just the sound of wind pushing through the high branches and the sense that the forest had taken her back. Thomas no longer trusted the cabin. He dragged a mattress outside and slept with his rifle clutched tight, barely closing his eyes, watching the tree lean for movement. The night he saw the figures, tall, silent, still, he didn't fire. He couldn't. His hands wouldn't obey him. They stood at the edge of the clearing until sunrise, unmoving, then dissolved into the mist like smoke drawn backward into a lung. On what must have been the 29th day since Julian vanished, Thomas finally descended the cellar stairs again, flashlight in hand, alone. The hatch had refused to close fully since Nora broke the lock, and something about that incomplete seal made it worse, as though the dark below had been breathing in and out all along. The steps creaked wet beneath his boots. The basement had changed, grown, maybe, or collapsed into itself. The walls were no longer brick but rough, earthen, carved with marks that pulsed faintly in the beam of the light. And at the far end, behind what looked like a melted filing cabinet and a mound of dirt shaped like a person lying down, Thomas saw it, a doorway. Not a physical one, but a shimmer, like heat waves in desert air, but colder than ice to look at. He reached for it. Later, when he awoke on the porch with frost covering his chest and the light gone from his eyes, he could not say what had happened. But he knew, without question, that he had been inside. And that part of him was still there. He did not go back into the house. He stayed outside, whispering to himself and drawing strange sigils in the dirt with twigs. When the rescue team finally arrived, drawn not by a signal but by a nearby wildfire that had driven them off course, they found Thomas half-frozen, eyes wide, lips cracked and whispering something over and over again in a language they could not identify. They never found Nora. They never found Julian. And the cabin, despite GPS markers and photographic evidence, could not be located again. The night over the savannah had fallen thick like smoke, deep and solemn, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what the land had endured. Stars barely pierced the blackness above, and the wind whispered across the scorched grass, brushing over the wounded buffalo's massive frame as he lay just beyond the watering hole, flanked closely by his loyal brother who had returned to him after hours of searching in the dark, following blood trails and crushed reeds, his own flanks heaving with exhaustion but his eyes alight with unwavering devotion, for there was no force in the wild greater than the bond that had been tested but not broken. Their herd had scattered during the ambush, trampled by terror, leaving only the whispers of hooves and cries in the dust, and as the older buffalo licked the younger's wounds with slow, steady strokes, the silence around them felt like something sacred, a moment carved out from chaos to remind them that they still lived, still breathed, and still had each other. Yet the peace was not to last, for the lions, those 4 that had tasted blood and rage, were not gone, only hiding, nursing their own bruises beneath the jagged cliffs a few kilometers north, licking their egos more than their flesh, for the battle that was meant to be an easy slaughter had instead become a myth to be whispered among predators. A buffalo who stood even while bleeding, who drove a lion into the air with his horns, who roared like thunder in the rainless night. Now, those lions did not rest but conspired, pacing in shadows, eyes glowing, tails twitching with the memory of failure, and one, the smallest, youngest, yet fiercest, began urging the others for revenge, for redemption, not just for the kill, but to reclaim their pride in the hierarchy of this ruthless terrain. And so, in the hours just before dawn, when the air cooled and the fog crept low to the ground, the lions began to move again, a silent formation, heads low, muscles taut, weaving through the gullies and elephant trails, stalking not just prey but purpose, and they came not for the herd this time but for the lone wounded buffalo and his defiant brother who still stood like a sentry beside him, unaware that this time, the enemy would come not in a furious sprint but with patience, with angles, with strategy born of desperation and humiliation. Yet as fate would have it, they were not the only ones watching. Far in the distance, an old bull who had once led the herd in better days, who had been driven out in a quiet coup months ago, now roamed alone, bearing the scars of past victories and betrayals, but on this night, something in his bones stirred when he caught the scent of blood and lions on the wind, and memories surged, of calves once defended, of night watches kept during storms, of brothers who once stood shoulder to shoulder in the rain, and he turned, lumbering toward the scent. Not out of duty but something deeper, a yearning to feel needed again, to matter, to fight once more for what had been taken, and as he drew closer, his sharp, ancient eyes spotted the silhouettes, the lions flanking the watering hole, the wounded brother lying prone, the standing buffalo oblivious to the encirclement, and the old bull snorted once, then lowered his head and moved, not fast, not loud, but with the kind of weight only age could carry, each step a sentence in a story not yet finished, and from the darkness he emerged like a ghost, a myth resurrected. Horns gleaming in the faintest moonlight, and with no warning he bellowed, a deep, guttural challenge that startled birds from the trees and froze the lions in their tracks. In that instant, the younger brother snapped his head around, nostrils flaring, while the wounded buffalo tried to rise, hooves scraping the earth, eyes wide with confusion and recognition, for he too remembered that voice, that call of leadership long silenced. And then the lions had no time for regret, for the old bull charged, not with recklessness but with the calm precision of one who had faced death many times and never blinked, his hooves pounding like war drums as he barreled into the youngest lion, sending him sprawling with a thud that cracked the hush of morning, and the others reeled, tried to flank, to bite at his sides, but the standing brother surged forward too, horns low, eyes wild with fury born of loyalty and gratitude, and together they turned the ambush into a battle, and the battle into a rout, as the lions, once so confident, so regal, now fled, tails between legs, licking new wounds and deeper shames, and in their place, the buffalo stood, three now, battered, panting, but unbroken, each one scarred by time and claw, but bound by something deeper than fear. When dawn finally broke, bleeding gold across the sky, it found them standing side by side beneath an acacia tree, the old bull's breath slow and steady, the younger brother's eyes scanning the distance, and the wounded one, still unable to rise fully, leaning against both of them, held not by strength but by the invisible threads of kinship, sacrifice, and a history written not in words but in the soil and blood of the savannah. And somewhere in the tall grass, a vulture circled, waiting, hoping, but for now the earth had not claimed its prize, for sometimes even in the wildest lands, the bond between brothers, and the return of an old warrior, can tip the scales against even the most certain end. The moon hung low over the scarred earth, casting pale light through the broken branches of the savannah as the air quivered with silence that wasn't peace but something heavier, the weight of aftermath clinging to every cracked leaf and bloodied trail. The buffalo's flank rose and fell slowly now, labored and shallow, each breath a rattling protest against time itself, the wounds from the lion's ambush still raw, the blood drying in thick black crusts, and the ghosts of the herd, his brothers, his sons, danced at the edge of his consciousness like smoke, not dead in flesh but lost in spirit, scattered by fear, fragmented by tragedy, and in that cruel hush, a wind began to stir, slow and mournful, passing over the plain like the breath of an old god remembering a song it had long forgotten, carrying with it the scent of damp soil, distant fire, and something older, memory, perhaps, or grief. The buffalo, who had once led his kind with pride, now could barely lift his head, yet in his dark eyes flickered something fierce, something not ready to be extinguished, and he recalled the moment the lions fell upon them, four from the sides, two from the rear, their golden forms like living flame, the panic of the young, the charge of his own body as he threw it against the hunters to save a calf that was not his own, and then the fall, the pain, the hours of silence beneath the scorching sun. But he did not die, not then, not that day, and something in the land seemed to know it too. For even the hyenas that had begun to circle earlier had vanished, as if the earth had whispered a warning. Far off, between the acacia trees, eyes blinked in the dark, watching, cautious, uncertain whether this fallen creature still possessed the will to rise again, and indeed, deep inside his chest, a slow burn rekindled, not rage, not revenge, but a longing, a duty unresolved. For he had seen one of the calves run east before the dust swallowed her small hooves, and he remembered her white tipped ears, the way she had stayed near her mother, the way her mother fell beside him, throat torn, eyes wide, never blinking again, and he knew then that the calf was alone, and so long as he drew breath, he would not let her fate be silence. With a shudder, he forced himself onto his side, legs trembling under his bulk, muscles torn and screaming, and the stars above seemed to flicker in rhythm with the pulsing behind his eyes. But he moved, first a crawl, then a stagger, and as he stumbled forward, he passed by the bones of another, a lion this time, neck broken from their final struggle, its mouth still parted in a silent roar, its golden mane soaked in black blood, and the buffalo did not look away, for there was no triumph in this, only consequence. He walked through the night, guided by instinct, by scent, by the faintest signs, a broken branch here, a smudge of dirt there, the distant cry of a frightened bird. And when dawn crept over the world again, smearing orange across the horizon, he saw her, just beyond a dried riverbed, curled against a thorn bush, too weak to cry, eyes wide and vacant, and she did not move when he approached, only blinked slowly as if unsure whether he was real or some shade from her fading mind. He lowered his head, touched his battered nose to her flank, and she shivered, then whimpered, then pressed her small body against his chest, and in that moment, he knew they had crossed something invisible, a line between death and survival, despair and hope, and he stood guard through the heat of day, nudging her toward sparse patches of grass, shielding her from scavengers with his looming form, never resting, not even when the heat grew unbearable, not even when his legs buckled and he had to lean against a fallen log to keep standing. For 3 days they walked, through thorn fields and dry gullies, along paths marked only by memory and scent, his wounds reopened and infected, his vision sometimes blurred by pain, but he never stopped, and at night, when she slept beneath him, her breathing soft and slow, he would stare at the stars and listen for distant hooves, for any sign of the herd, though he feared they had moved on, forgotten him, left him behind as the old and wounded often are. But on the 4th morning, as the wind shifted and brought with it the scent of fresh dung and disturbed earth, he knew they were near, and with his last reserves of strength, he climbed the ridge that overlooked the valley where green trees clustered near a hidden spring, and there, standing in the golden grass, were his kin, fewer than before, quieter, heads low, but alive, and the moment he bellowed, the calf at his side echoing him with a thin, trembling call, the heads turned, one by one, eyes wide with disbelief, and a ripple passed through the herd as recognition bloomed, and they came forward slowly, first the elders, then the young, surrounding him in a circle of scent and sound, touching noses, rumbling low greetings, and among them, one with a scar over his brow stepped forward and bowed his head, not as a challenge, but in respect, and the buffalo, wounded and trembling, knew his time as leader had passed, but that his story, his act, had restored something greater than rank. It had reminded them of who they were, what they protected, and as he lay down among them, the calf curled close, he felt not pride but peace, and the wind that passed over the valley now carried a new song, one of survival, of return, of a bond that even lions could not break.